Heard of the government's new taxes for property investors? You've probably also heard that new builds are going to get significant tax incentives or tax advantages. Hi, I'm Ed McKnight, economist here at Opes Partners, and in today's video we're going to tell you the 3 things you need to know about new builds and the significant tax incentives they have for property investors. But first, let's put some numbers around this. How much less tax will a new build pay compared to the equivalent existing property? Well, by our numbers here at Opes Partners, it's somewhere between 65 and 100k less in tax over a 15-year period. And if you want to know how that's calculated, head back to the first video in the 6-part series on the government's new tax changes. Now let's dive into the 3 things you need to know about new builds, because the first thing is that the cutoff date for what's considered a new build has been moved back in time. So when the first discussion document was announced, what the government said was 27th of March 2021. Anything after that, that is going to be considered a new build in terms of the Code Compliance Certificate being released. But if Code Compliance Certificate, if CCC was released before that date, not a new build, you're going to be paying more tax over time. Now, what happened in the legislation that was released late September 2021? They came out and said that cutoff date has been moved backwards in time. Now, this is something a lot of the media have not picked up on, because that cutoff date is now the 27th of March 2020. Now, you might say to me, well, Ed, what sort of difference does this really make? It makes a big difference to anybody who signed the contract to buy a new build property from late 2019 onwards, because from that date, that's where your Code Compliance Certificate was probably issued after that 27th of March 2020. Now, for us here at Opes, it's going to impact about 550 of our property investors that we've worked with. And let me ask you this, how much do you think these people collectively are going to save in tax? Well, over the next 15 years, it is an astonishing $37 million based on the mortgages that they've taken out. We believe these investors over that 15-year period will save $37 million worth of tax. So it's a small change, but it has a big impact. And this is something we lobbied the government pretty hard on here at Opes to make sure that that date was pushed back as far as possible, and make sure as well that property investors aren't paying more tax than they really should be. Now, I'm not calling it a present from the government, but it's certainly less bad compared to what we thought it was going to be. The second thing you need to know about new builds in terms of the tax incentives they have is that the tax incentive, the exemption, lasts for 20 years after Code Compliance Certificate has been issued. So let's say that you sign up to buy a property in 2021. Well, after construction, that property might receive its Code Compliance Certificate in 2022. Now, that means that you're able to claim the lower taxes for 20 years up to 2042. Now, after that, that property will start to be considered existing and you'll pay the higher taxes. But you've had 20 years worth of capital growth, 20 years of rental growth, and by that point, we'd expect that your rent would be high enough to be able to cover those additional taxes pretty quickly, or you can always sell that property at the end of the 20-year period. Now, speaking of selling the property, the other thing that's important to note is that if you sell the property within that 20-year period, the tax incentive stays with the property. So let's say you sell that property in 2032. So you've had 10 years worth of tax benefits. Well, the property has 10 years left to go. So the next investor purchasing that property, if it is an investor, they will be able to claim the tax incentives for the next 10 years after that before it reverts to an existing property. Now, again, you might say to me, Ed, what difference does this really make? Why do I care about this as a long-term property investor? Well, the thing is, you might set out intending to hold a property for 20 years, but life happens. So maybe you're forced to sell that property in 3 years. Maybe you're forced to sell that property in 5 years, 10 years. Well, what you probably want is for that tax benefit to continue as long as possible so that you could potentially sell to an investor, or you could sell to an owner-occupier. Now, if you weren't able to do this and you had to sell the property in 3 years, what happens? Well, an investor might be a bit more hesitant to pick up that property. In fact, you might only be able to sell that property then to an owner-occupier. So having that exemption or that tax incentives roll on to the next person probably gives you some confidence in purchasing this property, that you're not purchasing a property and that it's going to decrease in value because it doesn't have the incentive anymore. The third thing that you need to know about new builds is that the definition of what's considered a new build is pretty expansive. So it is not just buying a property off the plans from a developer or building a brand new property yourself. So let me give you some examples of what I mean by this. Let's say that you had an existing investment property with a pretty big section on the back. Well, let's say you build a minor dwelling on the back. That's a new build. That means that any of your interest costs, any of your mortgage costs associated with the minor dwelling, they're going to be tax deductible. Let me give you another example. Let's say you had a big 6-bedroom property, you divided it up into 2 separate dwellings of perhaps 3 bedrooms each. That is going to be considered, both of them are going to be considered new builds. So you're going to pay less tax compared to if you left it as a 6-bedroom house. Let me give you another example, relocatable homes. Let's say you bulldoze that 6-bedroom property instead, and you pick up a house from down the street, put it on the back of a truck, cart it down the road, plonk it there, and you get it signed off by council that this is the new dwelling here. That's considered a new build too. So you active investors out there, you might think, oh gosh, there's all these tax incentives for new builds, but there are some ways that you can access these tax incentives as well. Now, if you want to learn more about the government's interest deductibility tax changes, then check out our whole series, because this is only video number 2 of our 6-part series. So make sure you head over to our YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, and then you can check out those as well, because we do release a new video every Wednesday at 10 a.m. And hey, if you're looking to binge listen to some property investment content, check out the Property Academy podcast, because every single day we release a brand new episode to teach you something new about property investment. You can find that on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast listening app.